is it possible that the zero event explains the Carolina Bays? I'm starting to come to this conclusion simply because the more I'm studying this stuff, the more I'm seeing the evidence point in this specific direction. And what I want to do in this show is I want to present you guys with the evidence that I am seeing, and I want to go over the possibility that the zero event does indeed explain why the Carolina Bays exist the way they do. Now, I'll be straight up with everybody. I don't have a 100% solid answer. All right, so if you're expecting me to come out with some crazy, awesome, conspiracy theory that explains all of this stuff, no, that's not what's going on. And for anybody who thinks that the mainstream has an explanation for any of this, that's absolutely insane as well. All right, there's no geologist in the mainstream right now has a credible explanation for what the Carolina Bays actually are. All right, and it makes sense why they wouldn't, because modern geology has very little real science in their toolbox, right? They just don't have it. They have to look at these formations and they have to say, well, I think it took 1 billion years for this to happen, and I think some water showed up, or whatever. Well, mainstream geology is insane. Like, these guys, okay, all right, so this is what we're going to do. What I want to do today is I'm going to give you first, really quickly, a basic concept of what the Carolina Bays are, just really quick, because you can go watch like 8 million YouTube videos out there with this crap in it. But then I want to get to like the real science, the real possibility of what these things might be. And interestingly enough, and crazily enough, like the zero event might actually explain the Carolina Bays. And all we're going to do is follow evidence. Alright, so, look, I know, I have problems, and you're probably thinking, well, I mean, if you weren't such a schizo, you might have more than 4 subscribers, and I get that, but holy crap! It is so unbelievably frustrating and annoying and obnoxious when you are reading these papers, you are reading these books, you are watching these dissertations, and you see these mainstream geological scientists just spewing out garbage, just stumbling over themselves to try to make explanations work that have no scientific backing whatsoever. And then I know that other people are going to believe them because nobody is going to ask them any questions with respect to their conclusions. Oh, okay, all right. So, the evidence that I have been running into more and more as I dig deeper into some really good science. I don't know if all of you are aware, but lately there has been some really good work on the Carolina Bays. And unfortunately, the reality is this really good work is being done by mainstream scientists. And of course, mainstream scientists do not have all the scientific tools in their toolbox to explain the evidence that they are seeing. So, they're still going with the impact theory, or well, we'll cover some of that stuff. I do want to give some of their side of the perspective, for being fair, and then we'll get into what I believe may have actually happened, or at least the direction that we should be looking into to see if we can find a potential answer. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with the Carolina Bays, over here in North America, it was discovered that there were literally tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands potentially, of these crater-like formations that are all over the Atlantic coastal plain area over here on the eastern half of the United States. And this stuff ranges all the way from New Jersey down to Florida. Now, in between this range, between New Jersey and Florida, we find the highest density of these crater-like formations around the North and South Carolina area. So that's why they're called the Carolina Bays. But they are not exclusive to North and South Carolina. In fact, they're not even exclusive just to the east coast of the United States. These bays have actually been found all the way in the Midwest. Now, why does this matter? Who cares about a bunch of, craters that dot the United States? Well, if we're going to look at this from a historical perspective, a geological perspective, and ultimately a catastrophic perspective, these bays suddenly become important. Because what has happened is that once we got a hold of a technology called LiDAR, suddenly the entire east coast of the United States was just lit up with all of these ovular formations. Is that a word? Ovular? I don't know. Is it such circular-ish? How about that? Circular-ish ovular formations. Now, most people aren't going to care about this, but as a geologist, and from a geologist's perspective, these formations are fairly weird. They're anomalous. Now, one of the interesting things about the Carolina Bays is actually how mainstream has approached the situation. They've thrown out a few hypotheses trying to explain what the bays are, but even in the mainstream, nobody truly buys into any of them, at least not hardcore. And the reason why is simple. None of the hypotheses that the mainstream has presented really have any good scientific evidence to support them. Now, this is funny because geologists generally don't really seem to care about scientific evidence. They just, all they do is say, well, it took millions and billions of years. I don't need evidence, so I must be right. And then they move on, right? The Carolina Bays can't really fall into that perspective. And this is one of the things, or this is one of the aspects of the Carolina Bays that matters to the zero event, because the Carolina Bays are on the surface. They're right there at the top. So what that would generally mean is that these formations have to be relatively recent. And of course, geologists absolutely despise anything that is recent. All geological features have to have taken millions and billions of years to form. Right? You're not allowed to have any kind of a major formation happen, relatively recently and relatively quickly. The problem with the Carolina Bays is that mainstream geologists have no choice but to admit that these formations are indeed recent and they did not take millions of billions of years to form. And on top of that, all the proposed theories that would create these formations do not stand up to even the most basic of scientific probing. So what has happened is that the mainstream has kind of pushed the Carolina Bays off to the side. They're not hiding them like they're, some super secret UFO thing or something like that. It's just that geologists don't really want to talk about it, because the Carolina Bays are an indication that the vast majority of mainstream geological thinking is completely wrong. Ah, yes, now we get to the best part of the show. I mean, the best part will technically be where we lay out the whole zero event thing. But I don't know, making fun of geologists, pointing at them and laughing at them and mocking them and their unbelievably ridiculous, retarded explanations for the whole geological situation. I mean, that's pretty fun, man. I mean, if you ever see a mainstream geologist and they start talking to you about plate tectonics, the laws of nature allow you to walk over to that geologist and just start choking them out, right? Just grab them by their neck, just... Mainstream geology has proposed several theories on what could have created the Carolina Bays. And I want to go over what we will call the Carolina Bay coping mechanism, because that is all these theories are. Alright, so the first theory that these guys bring up is what they call the Aeolian and Lacustrine theory. And I don't know if that's how you pronounce Lacustrine, something like that. I don't remember. It's something weird. It doesn't even matter because it's wrong and stupid, so I don't really... Okay, alright. Alright, so the claim of this theory goes like this. Essentially, the people who believe in this theory think that the Carolina Bays were formed by wind and water over thousands of years in a pre-glacial environment during the Ice Age. And of course, it has to be during the Ice Age because that is the closest that geologists will allow any geographic formation to have formed close to the human time period. Right? You are literally not allowed to have any major geological formation happen after the Ice Age. It's literally not allowed in geology. The Ice Age is this magical cutoff time for all geologists. Everything has to have happened before the Ice Age, or while the Ice Age was still in existence. Anything that happens after the Ice Age is impossible. There's no such thing. It is completely impossible for any kind of a geological formation to form after this supposed Ice Age. Now, okay, all right, let me finish the theory. I said I would give them their due credit. Let's go through this. Okay, so the Aeolian theory believes that the oval shape or the circular shape of the Carolina Bay formations are essentially created by wind blowing sand and scouring the land and eventually creating depressions. All right, so then once this wind, for whatever magical reason, targets this specific area to create these little bays, what then will happen is that a process called ponding will take place. Basically, the newly scoured out pits will fill with water, and then erosion will start to take place with that water. And of course, they also mix in biological activity that will ultimately enhance the shape. It will, so we've got wind, water, and life going in there and creating these ovular shapes. And yes, there are geologists who believe this. Like literally. They are literally geologists who think magical wind and ponding created these very well aligned formations. Yeah, that you see what I'm saying? Like, you listen to these people, like, if you go and you read that study, by the way, that study was done, I think, in the 60s or 50s or something. Some dude, like, literally took a house fan, put it in front of this little test liquid or gel or whatever, turned it on, blew the liquid around for a second, said, well, I kind of basically got the formation, wrote a paper, and then mainstream geology essentially accepted that as the theory and as the explanation for decades. Like, nobody even questioned it until recently. This is what I'm talking about, man. This is why, when you start to read a geological paper, you look over at your gun rack, you're like, man, which one would do it? Okay. All right, so, but this is what some geologists believe in. Now, of course, you out there are all extremely highly intelligent, critical thinkers, and you are now laughing at this explanation because this explanation is beyond dumb. It's just stupid. I mean, that's all it is. The theory does not account for the raised rims of these of the craters. It does not account for the uniform orientation of the crater of the bays, craters, bays, whatever. It doesn't account for any of this. This is not real science. Okay, so mainstream geology, already stupid. Now, here's where the coping mechanism will start for mainstream geologists. So like I already said, within that particular theory, they throw that time period into the Ice Age era, or what a lot of people are now calling the supposed younger Dryas time period. Now, unfortunately, a lot of the alternative mainstream has also started to fall into this rut as well. So what has started to happen is that when they look at these bays, both the alternative and the mainstream, they start to think, well, these bays must have happened during the Ice Age, during some weird Ice Age kind of geological phenomena, and, well, we can't really prove it anymore because that was 13,000 years ago, so, we can't really show you how it was done, but we're pretty sure that they were created because the Ice Age existed. That's it. That is literally what they've got now. They literally just say there was some process during the Ice Age that when the ice melted or when something was happening, who knows, right? Some kind of magical process during the Ice Age created the bays. And because they make it sound smart, and because they'll cite each other's papers, and they'll just it makes it sound like a convincing argument, like they basically know what's going on, but they just need to find a little more evidence, but really don't think about it, right? Just don't worry about it. We basically have this answered, but because it's 13,000+ years ago, really, are we ever going to know? I mean, it doesn't really matter because it's the Ice Age. The Younger Dryas did it. Shut up. Don't worry about it. Just keep watching videos on TikTok or something. And that's what people do. Now, for the people who don't do it, they may ask a few more questions. And of course, they start to run into problems immediately as well. Because of course, the mainstream basic theory is not satisfactory. And it's not satisfactory even to a lot of mainstream geologists. I want to make sure that I'm saying that and being fair. Okay, so then what else could have created the bays? Well, okay, so the first problem though, right out of the door, is that everybody has decided for some weird reason that these bays had to have been created during the Younger Dryas. Like they had to. And why? Like what? Why? Where is this coming from? What is going on? Right? There's no real reason to believe that whatsoever. But what is happening is the psychology of the situation demands that you place it nowhere else other than in this particular area, because that is what is constantly being repeated. It has to be the Younger Dryas. It has to be the Younger Dryas. It cannot possibly have come after the Younger Dryas. Now, okay, and before we go further, I do not believe in the Younger Dryas. The Younger Dryas never took place. That is also a huge coping mechanism. There's no such thing as the Younger Dryas. It is hilariously bad. Right, and to be honest, the Carolina Bays is evidence that proves that there's no reason to believe in an Ice Age and no reason to believe in a Younger Dryas. All right, so not only does this support the zero event theory, but it also gets rid of garbage like the Ice Age and the Younger Dryas. Okay, all right, so what are these people believing? If you believe in the Younger Dryas, you believe that the Carolina Bays were created during this period of time, but how? Like what happened? How do you get these ovals? How do you get these orientations? And how do you get the scatter pattern of the bays themselves? Because interestingly enough, the bays have a very specific orientation. And people noticed this, right? So, okay, so what happened? It must be an impact. Yes, an impact must have happened. That would explain the cratering, and that would explain what we see. And everybody saw that and heard that theory and ran with it. And that's basically where we're at right now. All right, so what we have is what is essentially called the impact hypothesis. Now, the impact hypothesis has become incredibly enticing to both the alternative and the mainstream because it does a few things. Right? On the surface, it satisfies a real-world explanation for what could have happened. Right? Because we can all grasp an explosion. Right? We can all grasp the concept of one object hitting another. So basically, both the alternative and mainstream side of the scientific area, they started to come to an agreement. So basically, what happened is that or what needed to happen was a few things. Okay, so if you believe in the Ice Age, there's a lot of problems with that theory. The Ice Age theory really doesn't hold up under any real scientific scrutiny, and even mainstream geologists, at the end of the day, if you push them hard enough, will admit this, because it's very easy to do, actually. But one of the problems that there is with the Ice Age theory is that the Ice Age ends quickly. And I don't mean quickly as in thousands or, tens of thousands of years. No, the evidence shows that there was huge amounts of water action that roared across certain parts of the planet within like a day. Like this was not thousands of years or even centuries or even decades. The geological evidence itself, the hardcore real evidence, shows that there was some kind of a massive event that happened overnight. So they needed an explanation for this, and in fact, this is one of the reasons why the Ice Age theory was proposed at all back in the day. I think, the 1800s or something? Anyway, they needed to figure out a way to explain what they were seeing. and glaciers kind of started to work for them. But ultimately what started to happen after the Ice Age theory was proposed is that the evidence wasn't really lining up with anything, and they had to figure out a way to suddenly also have all of that ice melt, because obviously we don't have it anymore, right? Nobody's worried about 3-mile high glaciers on their continent. Except for Greenland, but Greenland is a completely different story, has nothing to do with the Ice Age, and that, I don't want to get into that. That's beyond the scope of this. Anyway, so geologists had to, they still do, they need some way to explain what triggers the melting of the ice. Like, what the hell happens? Because you have geological evidence and biological evidence that proves that something happened very, 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 very quickly. And it wiped out entire species on this planet. Right? It's there. There's nothing to argue about. So, mainstream geologists at first, they and I've talked about this, I'm not going to go over it that depth, but nothing they were really coming up with could explain a rapid warming of the Earth to create what they were finding with respect to evidence. And of course, impact theory shows up. And impact theory kind of starts to maybe give people some hope, right? Because, we know there are meteors and comets out in space. We know that these impacts can potentially happen. And we've seen it, actually. We have it on video and stuff like that. So suddenly, this theory starts to become enticing. But there's a problem. Because this also means that catastrophism is real. So this is the dilemma for the geologist. They don't like catastrophism. They don't like to admit that things happen suddenly and massively, and geological formations can happen overnight. They don't like to admit that. But the evidence supports only that. And there's nothing they can really do to argue that. So they need something. So the impact theory has become kind of the mainstream way of explaining the end of the Ice Age now, because it's got scientific validity and, of course, more importantly, they can push the catastrophe back, 10,000 plus years ago. And that's why they like it. Now, of course, they would prefer to be able to throw it back further, because admitting that there was a fairly massive catastrophe on the planet only 12,000, 13,000 years ago, that's a pretty big leap for a mainstream geologist. All right, and they're not happy with that. But that is becoming more accepted. One of the main reasons why is because there is a huge push for impact theory in general all over the place to essentially explain all kinds of features all over the solar system. And the reason why is simple. They don't have any other explanation to explain any of the other features that we find on Earth or in the solar system. Anytime they see a crater, the only thing that can possibly create a crater has to be an impact. That's it. It cannot be anything else. There's nothing in existence that could ever create the formations that we see that look like an impact site. It's impossible. Okay, so impact theory has gained a lot of momentum. And of course, on the alternative side, everybody loves that, because the alternative side isn't afraid of catastrophism. I mean, we have crazy stuff over there like a magical mud flood where, for whatever reason, people built state fairs or whatever, and then mud shows up, and whatever. It's insane. But, the alternative side is more open to catastrophism. And so what has happened now with the younger dryas is that they are fine with an impact. Mainstream geology is starting to come around, and of course the alternative mainstream unfortunately still buys into, more or less, the mainstream's side of geology. It's one of the biggest cognitive dissonance situations that I find right now with respect to research, is that the alternative mainstream doesn't believe the mainstream in a lot of stuff, because the mainstream is just outwardly corrupt and wrong, right? They acknowledge that, and it's obvious. It's right there. You can scientifically prove that the mainstream is lying. It's not hard. Very, very simple. And the alternative side sees that, but it's weird, because then the alternative side will also have no problem believing geologists when they talk about the Younger Dryas and the Ice Age. No problem at all. Oh, yeah, for sure. Oh, the Ice Age, 100% real. Absolutely. No question. All the other stuff, yeah, it's wrong. But the Ice Age? Oh, yeah, the Ice Age evidence. Oh, yes, absolutely. Evolution? Oh, yeah, you better believe it. 100%. Right? It's cognitive dissonance at its finest. That's all that is. Right? The psychological damage that has been done to both sides is legendary. Okay, anyway. So, because both sides have essentially come to a sort of an agreement, it's made the impact theory seem more viable. Right? So, okay, did I even say what the impact theory was? Okay, so here's basically kind of what they believe. And by they, I mean the alternative and the mainstream, more or less. So, right now, the general consensus for this right now the consensus is that a comet, comes to Earth, enters the atmosphere, and airbursts over the north part of the North American continent. Now, of course, everybody in the mainstream and the alternative side still believe that comets are dirty snowballs, even though now we know for a 100% fact that that is 100% wrong. But to make the Younger Dryas and the Ice Age work, they have to have dirty snowball comets, right? They've got to have it. Anyway, so this dirty snowball will explode magically over the North American continent, and it will essentially kickstart the end of the Ice Age. Now, with respect to the Carolina Bays, the bays are supposedly supposed to be created from the fragments of the comet that are blasted outward. Now, the reason why this sounds and looks like it's legit is because there really does appear to be some kind of a blast pattern relative to the orientation of the Carolina Bays. Now, this is one of the problems that mainstream geologists have with the bays, is that there is a legitimate orientation to the bays that ultimately all point towards the Great Lakes. Now, a standard mainstream geologist who tries to figure out some kind of a geological process that happens over billions of years that would create these bays runs into a very huge problem here. Because the bay's orientation doesn't match any known geological process that we have ever seen anywhere on the planet. We've never witnessed it. We have no other, there's just nothing anywhere that explains it. And of course, as I said earlier, the only experiment that was done essentially didn't prove anything. And it was a garbage experiment anyways. But to get the kind of conditions that would match the bay's orientations, out just in the wild would be, how do you do it, right? It's essentially an impossibility using regular standard geological processes. So the good news here is that we can immediately discard the mainstream geological point of view with respect to how these are created, because we can see that scientifically speaking, there is no standard geological process that can create the Carolina Bays. There's no such thing. So, and this is my favorite part of science, is absolutely dunking on mainstream geology. And I used to like it, but it's become so easy now that it's not as fun as it used to be, right? It used to be really fun. But now I'm just enjoying dunking on both the alternative and the mainstream, because these guys are still coming together under these ridiculous beliefs. Okay, all right, let's go on. So anyway, we really do see evidence for some kind of a potential blast. That's there, and I don't disagree with that. I do not disagree with that whatsoever. It's there, right? We can't get around it. But the problem comes into play when we start to look at the impact theory. Now, the first problem is that we are assuming that it is this, magical dust ball comet. To make matters worse is that NASA and pretty much any astronomer ever has never actually found a comet made of dusty ice. Like, it's never been found. Every single comet that we have ever flown to, right, it's always a rock. It's always a giant rock. That's what it is. It is a rock. It is not a dusty snowball, right? So we don't technically have any real reason to believe that a dusty snowball comet ever hit Earth in the first place, because as it stands right now, every comet that we know of is a rock. Now, I know some of you are probably saying, well, yeah, but I mean, the density measurements and stuff like that. No. The density measurements are not factoring in electricity, right? NASA is not looking at the charge of that rocky body. And I'm not going to go into get into it, but basically, obviously, the more charge you have, the more electrons you have. The more electrons you have, the more weight that you have. It's literally that simple, right? So if you're wondering, what the Earth was like 1,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, and why we were able to support megafauna and stuff like that, it's simple. The Earth's charge was different. That's it. That's literally the entire story. Right? The gravity was different because the charge was different. Okay, anyway, so the idea is that this dusty snowball comes in, explodes over North America, and then shoots out all of these fragments, which will then create the Carolina Bays. Now, on the surface, that sounds fantastic. If you ask no questions, and you have never learned any real science in your life, and you haven't read a single paper on NASA and what they find on comets, this sounds fantastic. So what has happened is that there is a pseudo-scientific explanation that relies on extremely old school science. And science that is now completely wrong, like it's been proven wrong. Remember, NASA themselves have proven this is wrong, right? So this is not me being a schizo. I did not just go smoke crack and start making a video. This is literally NASA themselves that have proved this. But nobody's paying attention. And the reason why is very simple. If you pay attention to real science, you have to rewrite everything that has come before. And neither the alternative or the mainstream want to do that. Remember, unfortunately, right now the alternative side has some people out there who make some good money off of peddling these explanations. Now, I'm not saying that these guys are, charlatans or exploiting people on purpose. I don't know. I don't know these people. But the reality is, this is what they make money off of. So if suddenly they have to admit that everything they've said is wrong, right? Like that's a death knell for their career. Or at least that's what they think. If they were real scientists, right? If you're a real scientist, you don't get a Netflix special. Let's put it like that, right? You're not getting a Netflix special if you're doing real science, because the people who are running the show are not interested in you knowing the truth. It's literally that simple, right? You don't even need a grand conspiracy for any of that. It's very, very basic human psychology. You are not going to be told the truth on Netflix. It's not happening. Okay, so it's not happening. So those people, if they were to pay attention to real science, literally have to throw everything that they based their life work on into the garbage. You know, how many people really want to do that? Yeah, not a lot. There's not a lot of people who are looking to throw their entire life into the garbage because, new science has proven them wrong. So that's what we're running into right now. Okay, so anyway, the impact theory sounds great if you don't pay attention to real science. Now, as a side note really quick, I am not saying that there are not potentially dusty snowballs out there, right? There very well could be, and I would guarantee is, chunks of ice floating around out there that could potentially smash into Earth. I agree with that. And in fact, as far as we can tell, we have had chunks of ice fall from space and smash into Earth during several of these catastrophes. That has been recorded, so that's a real possibility. Of course, none of these ice balls were exploding in the air, so, that gets a little weird. Okay, but anyway, it doesn't matter. However, if you would like to hold on to the dusty snowball impact theory, that's okay, because we're going to disprove it regardless, so it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's a physical, rocky body that's supposedly air bursted, or if it's a icy, snowy body. Doesn't matter. Doesn't matter. We need to get rid of this concept in general. Now, here's the problem that Carolina Bay people run into. The reason why they need it to be a snowball is because there is precisely zero evidence that supports a rocky body airburst over North America. Zero. There is zero debris from a supposed rocky body that would have exploded. Right? This is acknowledged by both the mainstream and the alternative. There is no debris from space that would spread out in this fashion that would support an airburst from a rocky body. Because that was never found, that means something essentially, you have to have an explosion, but you cannot have any debris. And this is the conundrum that the Carolina Bay people run into, right? This is what the Younger Dryas people have a problem with. Because you need an explosion to explain the Carolina Bays, because, of course, these people only have explosions, they only have impacts, they don't have anything else because they don't want to learn real science. But there is no debris to support that theory. So something else has to explode. And so, of course, a snowball fits perfectly. Because, unfortunately, most people still believe in the dusty snowball theory. So it's already going to get public approval. And then you can say, well, all the heat from the kinetic energy that would have been generated from entering the atmosphere would create a situation to where this dusty snowball would explode. And of course, everybody nods their heads like they know what they're talking about, in agreement. Yes, very smart, very accurate. And then of course, all of those ice particles and chunks would fly outward, and they would hit the ground, and they would create your Carolina Bay situation. And then because the parts are ice, the ice would melt, and then you have no need any longer for any kind of physical evidence for a cosmological impact. And this is how they get away with it. What they've done is they have created a fantasy situation that sounds scientific, that also allows them to not produce any evidence whatsoever that this is what happened. And they get to hide behind two major things here, right? The first one is obviously, well, it's a dusty snowball, or it's a big chunk of ice or something. I mean, all the water melted. I can't prove it, bro. You just have to believe me. And then, of course, once you start to ask real scientific questions of the theory, and you start to find all of the holes in their explanation, the next thing they do is they run away saying, well, it was 13,000 years ago. I can't prove it. I mean, it's 13,000 years ago, bro. What do you want from me? I mean, I can't prove that it happened, but it totally happened. Like, this is what the Younger Dryas and Ice Age people are doing. Like, this is how insane it is. They have no proof for any of their claims, but it's totally real, and if you don't believe it, you're a conspiracy theorist. Right? It's absolute insanity. All right, let's go over some of the evidence that shows why it's insane. And I know a lot of you right now are thinking, but there's so much evidence. I mean, there's like radioactive evidence, and the shape of the Carolina Bays really looks like a crater, and blah, 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 blah. And I get that, right? And you can believe that so long as you have done zero research and not looked at any of the science done with respect to the Carolina Bays. You can have that belief. Yes, but the very second you start to look at what's going on, everything goes out the window immediately. Like immediately. It's not even like a maybe it's a problem, but no, okay, all right. Let's go over the problems with the mainstream and alternatives version of the Carolina Bay situation. Now, the first and major, most hilarious problem of this theory is that if there was some kind of an impactor, we would expect to find an impact crater. Now, of course, there are people who believe that the cosmological body did smash into Earth to jumpstart the end of the Younger Dryas. There are a group of people who do that. However, for the people who believe there was a true impact, Well, if there was going to be an impact, we should have some kind of an impact crater, right? We should have it. It should be obvious too, because this crater would not be millions and billions of years old. It would only be like little over 10,000, right? That's it. It would still be there, and it should still be there. However, when we look around the area that the impact should have happened, guess what we find? We don't find a crater. We do not find a crater. There is no crater, right? So the crater should, in theory, be around the Great Lake area, right? If there was a true impact, it should be in the Great Lake area, and it should be incredibly obvious. However, when we look at the Great Lake area, we find no evidence of an impactor. Now, I know that there is a section of geologists who are trying to make excuses, trying to say that, oh yeah, it kind of looks like there's a crater here, kind of right here in the center of the... No. That's all cope. That is pure cope. If there was an impact only 10 to 13,000 years ago, it would be dreadfully obvious. Incredibly obvious. There's no question. So, for the smaller group of people who honestly believe that there was a true impact 13,000 years ago, you have to supply a crater. There's no way around that. And they have been unable to do that. There's a lot of geologists that will cope, and they will try to say that there's some kind of a sort of crater over there in the Great Lake area, but ultimately their interpretation of the geology in that area is so bad that the majority of mainstream geologists don't agree with them either. That's how pathetic this is, right? So an actual impactor doesn't work. I mean, you know your theory is garbage if you're a mainstreamer and the majority of mainstreamers disagree with you, okay? It's not gonna work, and it doesn't. Sorry, it doesn't. There's nothing there. All right, so we can put aside that part. Now, because that doesn't work, this is why the air bursting theory was created. Because we know there's no crater, and there's not. We do not have debris, and we'll get into that in a second, but we don't have a crater. So we still need some kind of a quote-unquote impactor, but instead of it impacting the crust, let's have it explode in the air. Oh yeah, like Tunguska. Yeah, just like Tunguska. And that's what they've done, right? It's a total coping mechanism because the evidence does not allow for a real impact. So you still need your explosion because that's all that cosmological people and geologists have, right? Are impacts and explosions. But you can't have evidence for it. So it has to be a snowball that air bursts above the North American continent. Okay. All right, so yeah, this is the level of delusion that the alternative and the mainstream are living in. It's hilarious to watch them jump through these hoops. Okay, anyway. Now, with an air burst, that means that you aren't necessarily going to get a crater. And to make sure that they get around the crater part of this, they also run over to the Ice Age part of the Younger Dryas and they say, well, it exploded above, a large 3-mile thick ice sheet. So the ice sheet took the brunt of all of the kinetic energy. And so that's why we don't find a crater, because not only did the comet itself melt, but so did the crater that it created melt. So we have no evidence, but it was totally real, bro. This is what these people do. What do you want from me? What do you, just watching them, talk about this stuff is just a circus show, man. It's really? Really? And they say it with a straight face. They don't see any problem with this, right? And they don't see any problem with it because they can reference the Tunguska explosion and say that this is what happened, right? Because we find a similar situation potentially with the Tunguska explosion. I'm not going to get into that because that gets weird as well. But that's what they do. So your average person who will not question any of this and has no real knowledge of geology or real cosmology or plasma or electricity or anything just nods their head and thinks, oh yeah, that makes perfect sense. We're so smart. We're so advanced. Right? And they run off with it, and then they get TV shows, and they start doing podcasts, and then everybody starts believing them because it sounds really good. right? And that's where it goes. It takes off from there. Okay, all right. But no crater. There's no crater, and we have convenient excuses for why there is no crater. All right, this is not how science works, but whatever. They run with it. Oh, it's so frustrating. It is so frustrating. I mean, we don't even have any evidence at all of shock metamorphism. Right, for those of you who are not familiar with what shock metamorphism is, basically we would expect an impact to leave some kind of feature in the geology around the area, such as like shocked quartz, impact melt, or messed up breccia, to be present in the area of the explosion or of the impact. And none of that exists. Not only does none of that exist in a non-existent crater over the major impact site, even the Carolina Bays themselves have no sign of this metamorphism. There's nothing there. Right? What that means is that if you believe in an impact theory, you believe in a theory with no evidence. Like literally no evidence for it. Zero. Nada. There's nothing. All right. So when we look at this aspect of the theory, we find nothing but coping. Right? People are grasping at straws because otherwise the Carolina Bays don't make all that much sense. Another problem that we run into is we find a situation to where the substratum itself, with respect to the Carolina Bays, I know, let's talk about the Carolina Bays now. The Carolina Bays have no substrate penetration. Right? One of the things that we have to remember is that these bays are relatively shallow ovals. And they were made in soft sediment. They're not sitting there in hardcore rock. They did not melt rock. Remember, there's no metamorphism going on. Right? They're literally like just dug out of the sand and loose soil. That's what the Carolina Bays are. Now, that's another problem, by the way, for anybody who thinks that this took place 10, 12, 13, 14,000 years ago. Even worse, there's a section of geologists who believe the bays are even older. Right? There's some geologists who will date the bays up to like 100,000 plus years. Now, those guys are fringe even in their area, but I'm just saying they're there. Right? But the concept is ridiculous. Why? Why is the concept ridiculous? Well, 10,000 years is a long time for things to happen to the top layer of the planet. Okay, to think that the bays would sit there for that long, remaining in the shape that they remained in for over 13,000 years, no, it's not happening. It's not happening at all. The bays would have been affected by all kinds of geological processes that happened very quickly. You know, a lot of them would have been washed away. A lot of them would have been eroded away, or a lot of them really should have been filled up. We do not see evidence of any of that happening. So the 10 to 13,000 years ago situation, I don't buy it. I don't think, and we'll get to even more detail here in a second, but it doesn't work. All right, the natural geological processes of the planet would have absolutely done way more damage to those formations. Right? They should not look the way they look. Now, if you don't believe me on that, there's another feature to the Carolina Bays which proves this. So when you look at the actual shape of the bays and you go to one of them, what you will find is that the bays are still relatively intact. By that I mean they have their outsides are still raised up, not eroded away. I mean, the bays themselves really do look fairly fresh. I mean, they have not been sitting there for thousands of years. Certainly not for tens of thousands of years. Right? They do not match geologically with erosion patterns in the area. They do not match with fill patterns of the area. It doesn't work. It's funny. The theories of mainstream geology literally disproves the concept of an older version of the Carolina Bays. The Carolina Bays, ultimately, at the end of the day, are not that old. And this is where we really run into problems. For both the alternative and the mainstream. Both people are going to hate this. Because both sides right now really agree that there was such a thing called the Younger Dryas, and that it ended quickly in a catastrophe, but it has to be 10 plus thousand years old. It cannot be any more recent. All right, it's too much for most people. And it's funny, the only reason why this is too much for most people is because this is how we have been psychologically trained to think. Right? We have all been trained in uniformitarianism. Nothing can happen relatively recently that's major. It's impossible. Even though all the evidence supports that, it can't happen because Professor Shlomo says no, it can't happen. And of course, the vast majority of people believe it. And now people with Netflix specials are pushing this stuff, and the alternative side follows without a question. Right? But once you start to look at the Carolina Bays using real science, you suddenly run into all kinds of problems. The impact hypothesis has no validity whatsoever. The airburst impact hypothesis has no validity whatsoever. None of this does. You know, it's funny here. Let's shoot this down really quick. I can put the final nail in the coffin, and then we can look at the other funny evidence. So, okay, if the Younger Dryas was real and the Ice Age is real, and this comet comes in and explodes, right, and it kickstarts the end of the Ice Age, that means you have massive amounts of flooding that's going to take place, right? And this is true. This is one of the geological problems that geologists have in North America, is that North America shows unequivocally, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that a massive amount of water action flowed over the entire continent, or at least the eastern half of the continent, let's say. All right, the Sierra Nevadas gets a little weird. That's a whole other geological process that, interestingly enough, happens simultaneously, by the way. But anyway, from a geologist perspective, North America, the eastern half of North America, is a problem because it shows massive water action. Now, what geologists have done and alternative people do is they say, well, it was an ice age that did it, right? It was these slow glaciers that moved really slow and created all that evidence. Even though the evidence doesn't work with glaciers because the striational rock patterns are all over the place, they do not follow any kind of an ice flow. Anyway, I've talked about that. Anyway, the point is here is that if an impactor created or kick-started the end of it, you're going to have massive amounts of flooding, right? Right? That's part of the Ice Age Younger Dryas theory, is that people are willing to admit that, yeah, there had to have been some major floods, right? Like that stupid Lake Missoula situation, right? That whole thing is hilarious. Don't get me started on Lake Missoula. I swear to God. Okay. But here's the problem. The Carolina Bays would have been created before the ice melted, right? Because if the impactor is what starts that, I don't know, heat wave or whatever you want to call it, that means that those Carolina Bays would have been created before the ice melts. Once the ice started to melt and we started to have all that water rushing down, what would have happened to the Carolina Bays if it was faced with flooding? Because don't forget, remember, the Carolina Bays are in extremely soft soil and sand, right? They are not embedded in the bedrock. It's nothing like that. What would happen when major floods overrode those soft sedimentary bays? If you said it would completely wipe them off the map, you are correct. Congratulations, you're a real geologist. The Carolina Bays would never have survived anything like the end of the Ice Age or the Younger Dryas. It's impossible. They never would have survived it. Because all of the evidence shows that massive floodwaters ran through that area at some point in time. And of course, both the alternative and the mainstream blame the Younger Dryas for those. And of course, both the alternative and the mainstream blame those floodwaters on the end of the Ice Age. The Carolina Bays literally cannot exist if the Ice Age theory or the Younger Dryas theory is real. It would be impossible. Those bays would have been wiped off the map from the flooding. Done. They would be gone. There would be no such thing as the Carolina Bays. But they are present. Right, so what does that mean? Well, it means that the whole concept of the Younger Dryas and the impact theory and all that garbage is just dumb. You don't need it. You literally don't need it. There's no reason for it whatsoever. Like, you just don't need it. And the scientific evidence doesn't support it. Now, for those of you thinking that mainstream science has some kind of a magical way of dating these, Now, for those of you who believe that mainstream science has some magical way of dating these formations, I have bad news for you. Mainstream science has no way of dating these formations. None. Zero. Zilch. There's no way to date these things at all. We have no reliable way of dating these. Right? Remember, this is why I said there's literally a group of geologists out there who say that these things are 100,000 plus years old. Right? There is no consensus on the date. The dating system right now that revolves around 13,000 years ago, that is literally just a subjective interpretation. Right? They are literally pulling that out of their ass. And they're doing that because it sounds good. And because people nod their head in agreement. And because there's a bit of a consensus there. Right? That's it. That's literally all the reason why these people believe this. There is no evidence of what date these things took place. But if we go off what I just said, very basic geological processes, the fact that these bays are in soft sedimentary sand, right, they would not last that long. And if you believe in the Younger Dryas, it would be impossible for them to survive the event. So what does this mean? It means that whatever caused the major flooding across North America had already happened, and the event that creates the Carolina Bays comes at a later date. It is that simple. The science shows that perfectly. So what actually happened? Well, here's what I think may have happened. Or at least here is a quick breakdown. Now, we have tons of evidence for some kind of massive water action on the North American continent not that long ago. Remember, this evidence is very surface layer in a lot of areas, and if it's buried, it's not buried that deep. So what this means is that massive water action affected the entire half of the entirety of North America. So what the hell do you do to create that? All we have to do is listen to North American Indian mythology and we find out. And when we go and study that, what we discover is that there was a massive cataclysm ushered in by Venus. The Venus event is responsible for all of the evidence that the Ice Age and the Younger Dryas tries to explain. All right, the Venus event, Venus essentially does several flybys of Earth in a cometary form, and during these contacts, Venus will ultimately drag part of the ocean over the North American continent and create the water action evidence that we see. All right, so that basically scours and changes the entire surface of the planet, by the way. So that's massive destruction. Once that settles down, there will be around 6 to 7, maybe 800, 900 years of relative peace. Until eventually, Earth will start to get closer to the planet Mars. Earth will have several encounters with the planet Mars every 12 years, only around 1,000 years ago. This period in time, this cataclysmic period in time is known as the Zero Event. And during this cataclysmic encounter with the planet Mars, I think this is where you will get the situation that will create the Carolina Bays. So right now, all evidence shows that it could not have taken place 10 to 13,000 years ago. I've already disproven the concept of the Ice Age Younger Dryas being possible to explain the entire Carolina Bays situation. It does not work. So we need something else. Some other kind of a cataclysm has to take place. Well, there is another way that we could potentially create the Carolina Bays. And of course, it has to happen relatively recently. So what do we do? Well, the interesting thing is that the Carolina Bays have the shape and form of being hit by electrostatic discharge. What that means is that there was no impacts, but instead massive lightning strikes would have hit the area around North America and could have been responsible for the Carolina Bay formations. Now, of course, the major issue with this here is we need somewhere for the charge to come from. What is going to generate enough electricity to create a plasma strike on this planet that would do what we find with the Carolina Bays? Because that's not a small plasma bolt, right? That is one hell of an event, I promise. If you saw that, well, if you saw it, you probably went blind, but it would be insane. But you need something to have that discharge. If we had a charged body, something like Mars, getting close enough to us, and if Mars was still holding some kind of a charge in itself, and it got closer to Earth, and Earth's magnetosphere touched Mars's, guess what would happen? Very basic electrical science. When you have two differently charged bodies that come into contact, what happens? You are going to have electron exchange. I'll be polite. And this is exactly what I think happened during one of Mars's close encounters with Earth. During one of these close encounters, both of the magnetospheres essentially touch, and there will be an electrical exchange. And this electrical exchange will smash into North America and will ultimately create the Carolina Bays. And of course, this happens long after the Venus event, right? This happens during a time where we find the continents in the general shape that we see them today. And this is exactly what we would expect if the Carolina Bays were relatively recent. If we listen to the North American Indian mythologies, we find out that this is exactly what happened. Lightning from the sky on a huge scale. When we look at the composition of the Carolina Bays, we do not find a composition that supports any kind of an impact. Instead, we find a composition that supports a literal lightning strike, just on a scale that most people are not ready to believe is possible. However, there is nothing unscientific about anything I've just said. Now, if the Mars part sounds crazy, remember, I'm not making that up. That's what the North American Indians tell us. That's what every single culture on this planet records. There is a period of 12-year intervals for about a century to where Mars threatens Earth. Now, unlike the Venus event, where Venus actually crosses orbits with Earth, which is why it was infinitely more destructive, Mars doesn't do that. Mars and Earth just come close enough to one another. Close enough to where Mars could be seen probably about as large as we see the moon in the sky today. And I know that sounds crazy, but that's what the history supports. And ultimately, when we look at something like the Carolina Bays, that's what the science also suggests. The Carolina Bays, right now, in my opinion, are simply one of the cataclysmic scars of the close approach of the planet Mars around 1,000 years ago.